Now that we've had a look at the gross anatomy of the renal system, let's have a look at the microscopic anatomy. The nephron. There are 1 million nephrons per kidney, so you can tell it's quite an important structure. It is the site of filtration, reabsorption and secretion, different mechanisms that we'll go through in later slideshows, but which cover most of the functions of the kidney. The nephron is made up of the renal corpuscle here, which we'll go through next. But now we'll have a look at the proximal convoluted tubule. Now proximal means nearest to. You'll remember that in limbs we talked about proximal being closest to the trunk. In the nephron, proximal means closest to the renal corpuscle. Convoluted means goes around and around. Like a story that doesn't really have much sense to it, that's a convoluted story. So the proximal convoluted tubule is near the renal corpuscle, goes around and around in lots of loops, and is a tubule, or a type of vessel, a hollow structure. Then we have the loop of Henle, which is also known as the nephron loop. It is the structure here that is a fairly straight U shape. It's important for salt and water absorption. Then we have the distal convoluted tubule, which actually starts a little bit lower than this diagram shows. As we'll see later, it runs next to the glomerulus. It's affected by hormones and is the site of the macula densa. The macula densa is part of the juxtaglomerular apparatus, a long name that we'll pull apart in the next slide. So let's have a look at the renal corpuscle. The predominant structure in the renal corpuscle is the glomerulus, which is this collection of capillaries shown here in cross-section. I've also got a picture of it down here which shows glomeruli taken from a real body, where they've put plastic into the vessels and then dissolved the kidney away, and you're left with the shape of the body. Going into the glomerulus is the afferent arteriole. Afferent. Remember, it starts with A, which is at the beginning of the alphabet and the beginning of the glomerulus. This is important because then we have the efferent arteriole, which goes away from the glomerulus. We also have a Bowman's capsule around here, and that collects filtrate. Filtrate is the fluid that is filtered from the blood. Let's write that down. And it becomes urine. The Bowman's space is this area here between the Bowman's capsule and glomerulus. That is where the filtrate first enters the nephron. So the Bowman's space. Then we have the juxtaglomerular apparatus. I'm going to do that in a different colour because it's quite complicated. Juxto means next to. Glomerular means glomerulus. And apparatus means structures. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is this section here between the distal convoluted tubule and the arterioles. And is a number of different tissues that respond to the concentrations in the filtrate flowing through the distal convoluted tubule and the blood pressure in the systemic vessels, and ends up producing hormones, which we'll talk about later. How does the nephron connect to the rest of the body? Via vessels. There are two main areas through which it connects. The capillaries, which go on to the renal vein, and the collecting duct, which goes on to the pelvis of the kidney. Let's have a look at the collecting duct first. The collecting duct is this long structure here that is connected by distal convoluted tubules and collects all the filtrate that will pass into the pelvis, which we talked about earlier. Multiple nephrons collect to each collecting duct. Then we have two types of capillaries surrounding the nephron. These have different functions, but we won't go too far into that. The important part is that there's the vasa recta, these long straight vessels around the loop of Henle, also called the nephron loop. Let's write that in. Loop of Henle. And then vasa recta actually means straight vessels, so they're the straight ones around the straight nephron. Then we have the peritubular capillaries. Now these are a lot more, well, convoluted, and they go around the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. And they circle around and go eventually to the renal vein, as do the vasa recta. But where do they come from? Both of them come from the efferent arteriole. So let's draw that here. So to summarise, we have the afferent, or the renal artery, rather. The afferent arterioles. This is too small, but you can see. The glomerulus, efferent arteriole, the vasa recta, and peritubular vessels. Oops. And eventually back to the renal vein. Finally, let's have a look at some real pictures of the glomeruli. Number 1 shows a real glomerulus. 2 shows a proximal convoluted tubule, and 3 shows a distal convoluted tubule. So you can see how they're all wound around together. Over here on the right you can see more clearly a picture of the glomerulus, and is my favourite image in all of medical science. Also on here you can see the 2 arterioles going into the glomerulus and vessels surrounding it. This is the Bowman's space, and around that is the Bowman's capsule.